to discuss the structure of a typical thoracic vertebra. This is a typical thoracic vertebra. The identification features of this vertebra are that they can be identified by demifacets. They have demifacets on each side of the vertebral body. Let's have a look in detail. Before we begin, I would like to mention that thoracic vertebra from T2 to T8, that is second thoracic vertebra till 8th thoracic vertebra, they are the typical vertebrae. Thoracic vertebra 1, 9, 10, 11 and 12, they are atypical vertebrae. We will discuss about them later in the video. So this is a typical thoracic vertebra. This is the anterior part of the vertebra, and this is the posterior part of the vertebra. This is the vertebral body, whereas the posterior part is the vertebral arc. So beginning with the vertebral body, the vertebral body is heart-shaped. It is heart-shaped and it is equal in dimensions from every side, from side to side and forward and backwards. It has the same dimensions. The body of the typical thoracic vertebra, it has demifacets on each side. It has 2 demifacets on each side, as we can see here. This is the superior demifacet, and here is the inferior demifacet. I'll show you on the other side as well. This is the superior demifacet, and this is the inferior demifacet. The superior demifacet, it is close to the pedicle. These are the pedicles of the vertebra, that are the bony pillars of the vertebra. And the superior demifacet or the superior costal demifacet is near the pedicle of the vertebra. It articulates with the head of its own rib. The head of its own rib articulates with the superior costal demifacet. So the superior costal facet, for example, if this is third thoracic vertebra, if this is T3, so the superior costal demifacet of T3 will articulate with the head of third rib. It will articulate with the head of third rib, but the head, it partially articulates with its own superior costal demifacet and partially with the inferior costal demifacet of the vertebra above. Moving on to the inferior costal demifacet. This is the inferior costal demifacet and it articulates with the head of the vertebra below. The inferior costal demifacet of T3 will articulate partially with the head of T4. Moving on to the pedicles. Pedicles, they are straight and are directed backwards. The superior vertebral notch, it is quite shallow. As you can see, it's not deep, whereas the inferior vertebral notch, this is the inferior vertebral notch, and it is deep. It has a deep inferior vertebral notch and a shallow superior vertebral notch. Posterior to the vertebral notch are the laminae. These are the laminae of the vertebra that form the roof of the vertebral arc. They quite overlap each other. From the junction of the pedicles and the laminae arise superior articular processes. These are the superior articular process of a typical thoracic vertebra that arise from the junction of pedicle and lamina. They are flat and they face backwards because this is the anterior side of the vertebra and this is the posterior side of the vertebra. So these articular processes, they are facing backwards in the posterior direction. Moving on to the inferior articular processes. This is the inferior side of the vertebra. This is the inferior view of the vertebra, the body and the arc. The inferior articular processes, they face forward in the forward direction. that is towards the body of the vertebra. As you can see, they're facing forwards, whereas the superior articular processes, they face backwards. The typical thoracic vertebra have a facet on the anterior side of the transverse process. These are the transverse processes of the typical thoracic vertebra. This view is the posterior part of the transverse process. They are posterior surface of the transverse process, and this is the anterior surface of the transverse process. The anterior surface of the transverse process, they have a facet at the tip. This is the tip of the transverse process, and you can see there is a facet. Similarly, on this side, at the tip of the transverse process, on the anterior surface of the transverse process, there is a facet. These facets are present for articulation of the tubercle of its own rib. So the facet on T3, if this is third thoracic vertebra, it will articulate with the tubercle of the third rib right here. We will discuss the structure of ribs in detail in the later videos. Moving on to the spinous processes. The spinous process of thoracic vertebra is inferior to the laminae and quite long. The spinous processes of T5 to T9, from 5th thoracic vertebra to 9th thoracic vertebra, they are the longest, whereas the spinous processes of the other thoracic vertebra are not that long. And this right here is the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen, it is quite small and it is circular. That's all for the typical thoracic vertebra.